Well, hello everyone. Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Markku Niemivirta, who is an expert in educational and psychological research, especially in domains of motivation, psychological well-being, and achievement and performance. He has also specialized in methodological expertise in the areas of large-scale comparative research, longitudinal research, and advanced multivariate methods. He is a professor at the Institute of Behavioral Sciences of the University of Helsinki, where he develops research and teaching on developmental relationships between motivation, achievement, and subjective well-being, situational dynamics in motivation and task engagement, and currently his research interests also focus on the links of developmental educational psychology and cognitive neuroscience. He has a regular publication activity, including over 70 publications, namely in high standards journals, and he is also a member of the editorial board of various scientific journals of psychology and education. As it is well known, he has been an active SIG member with regular participation at ICM and early conferences, presenting research under different formats, collaborating in the reviewing juries, and also showing availability to share and mentor younger researchers in summer schools. On a more personal note, I would like to mention that Markku has worked with a research group from the University of Porto, Portugal, where I had the opportunity to appreciate his expertise on a sophisticated use of advanced methods of analysis of data, trying to simplify and clarify the meaning of the data while simultaneously acknowledging the complexity of the motivational processes involved in learning. Today, he will present us research and will discuss the many phases of success, balancing between well-doing and well-being. Thank you, Markku, for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me. When I was invited, I thought, how could I present something that I could link to the topic of the conference? Because I would want to sort of respect what the theme is here. And I thought that, okay, if I frame this in a certain way, in the challenging context of Finnish educational discourse at the moment, maybe I can link these two issues. I'm more familiar with motivated persons, but let's see how I can combine these. And then I wanted to look at, based on what we do in our research, the different phases of success. But when I worked on the presentation, I realized that it will be quite a bit too complicated. So this is where I started from. I decided to move to just two phases of success. So it will be a slightly less complex view on the issue. So about the theme, as I said, we are going through an educational reform in Finland, and the discussion is quite lively and interesting. So the context for working in this field is very interesting at the moment, and I would like to think, how does my research contribute to that discussion? So I will take a look into this broader framework first very quickly. You might be familiar with the Finnish success story in PISA assessments. So I will go through these quite briefly, but you will see the green bars on the graphs which actually tell the whole story. So this was the case in 2000 with Finland in reading, mathematics, and science. This was the situation in 2003, 206, we're still very happy. 2009, still looking quite good. And then this happened. We dropped dramatically, as they say. I'm not sure if that really is the case, but this brought up the crisis in Finland. And they also found the reason for that. It's right here. The kids don't like school in Finland. So there's an interesting equation. And in fact, if you look at the whole data across different countries, it looks like this. The less kids like school, the better they do in PISA. Drawing educational policy implications is a bit tricky from here. So you might want to remind those people that it's a bit tricky issue to look at effects on an aggregated level when we're looking at student differences. As you see here, the more kids feel being bullied, the more they like school. It doesn't really make any sense on an individual level. So you have to be careful about these interpretations. Now, if we look at that one component that resulted in a crisis in Finland, kids not liking school, I'm not sure if that really is a valid inference. This is a follow-up, nationally representative data on the same question that they had in that situation. So approximately 60, 70, almost 80% of the students, depending on the educational context, do like school. And it has been increasing over the time. So it's really not probably the one issue to blame. But at the same time, they feel that the workload is quite high. So this sort of tension between workload and increase in liking creates this issue that I want to address today. How should we understand achievement strivings, and is there a price for success? Of course, now we would need to define what success in this context means, but I'm not going into that too far. And next, the implication of this, if this is the case, if there is a price for success, who should we worry about? Who are the students that we should worry about? And what could we do about that? So now I sort of artificially get into the motivated persons part, which is more what I actually do in research. Actually, 20 years ago, I participated in my first conference. I was still doing my master's work. It was the predecessor of this conference, so it's an anniversary year for me. And at that conference, I met Monique Buchhardt. Is Monique here? Yeah. And she showed me the way. So we started actually collaborating quite quickly after that. And we ended up with a chapter where we sort of outlined a model, one of those, similar to many others, that reflects the ideas that we had. And one of the key ideas of this model, this is a very simplified version of that here, is that students are balancing between trying to restore their well-being at the same time that they try to respond to the demands of the different tasks in school. So basically, it's a cyclical process all the time that has two different sort of pathways, and you can fluctuate between those. When things go well, you can focus on a task, you feel good, it's an uplifting experience. But then when things go bad, you start worrying about yourself, your image, your presence. Just like now, if I saw that you would start to sleep or leave the room, I would engage into this mode instead of the other one that I try to hold on to desperately. So it's a fluctuating thing, but still there's these two key sort of aspects of this whole self-regulating process. So I will just draw two sort of basic assumptions of this model that I think are the key for my talk today. So from the perspective of the student, any learning and performance situation is always a kind of a coping situation. It can change quite quickly if things happen in that situation. But then again, we have certain tendencies and dispositions, motivational lenses that we look at the situation through, which sort of influences what we do in the next step. And one of those key aspects are the goals that we strive for. So we could look at the many different components of this model in order to study these issues, but today here I will focus on certain individual differences and how those individual differences influence a lot of other things. And the factor that I'm focusing on is what I call achievement goal orientation. Briefly defined, I would say that's a disposition that manifests itself in students' propensity to select certain goals and to favor certain outcomes. In our work, we have focused on 5 different types of orientations. I'm not going into the discussion what's the difference between goals and orientations, so I will just cut that corner. But this approach basically draws on the work by John Nichols, mostly, maybe Covington as well. So the 5 different orientations that we look at are these 5. We could define these differently or describe them differently, but in parentheses I think you will find what the sort of core of this orientation is. Whether the focus is on subjective mastery, absolute success, relative incompetence, or just avoiding work and effort. And if you look at the correlations, this is what we usually get in almost independent of the age and the context. You can see how these different orientations relate to each other and how they are different from each other. But I'm not going to go into that detail either. And the other thing is that usually when we work with these orientations, we follow what we call a person-oriented approach. So we're not that much interested in individual scores or their predictions, but rather the profiles of these different scores. So what we do with those 5 orientations is that we classify students based on them. And we use statistical criteria to define how many actual groups we can find in the data. So we're not just saying that there are 3 or 7 or 24. Usually what we get is 4 to 6 different groups, and usually in those 4 to 6 different groups, we have at least 3 very similar ones all the time. I will describe this because now this will follow with the rest of the presentation, so I hope now you can still pay attention to that. So I hope you understand the graph correctly, because all the other slides are similar graphs. So this, I have now, okay, let me say, I have standardized all the different data sets that we have, the results, so that I try to use the same presentation format. So I use standardized scores. So the middle, the 0 is always the sample mean. So it's relative difference, not the absolute difference. So this profile now here is one very common. It's the sort of a typical average student, of course. It's the average sample average in many ways. But it also shows that slight emphasis on relative emphasis on mastery and avoidance, which is common to Finnish students. Usually this one is the largest group. Then we have one interesting group, the one that we would want the students to be like, high in mastery orientations, and another kind of approaching sort of group, but with tendencies on both mastery and performance, and then more towards the avoidance aspect of performance. And unfortunately, we always find this group with very strong emphasis, relative strong emphasis on avoidance. Sometimes that group might be even 1/4 of the whole sample. Talking about Finnish success in education. Now we have replicated this sort of same profiles. As Marina mentioned, I've collaborated with them and other groups as well Here we have one from Lisbon, quite similar even with the different instrument. So this is the one by Einar Skalvik. And this is the one with Marina. We used, what do you call it? The instrument by Carol Midgley and the others. Pulse, yeah, exactly. Again, similar profiles. Even with 7-year-olds based on teacher ratings. But as I said, I will focus on this one and only these two groups because, as I said, I will look at two phases of success. So mastery-oriented, performance-oriented. Now again, I simplify a bit the terms and the approach that we use here. So why these two? Because we usually don't find any differences in the school achievement between these students. And if we look at some other education or school-related factors, the positive kinds that we want to look at, we hardly find any differences. So educational goals and progress in those goals, effort put towards those goals, and then cynicism, which is sort of a negative aspect of the same sort of engagement. And as you can see, relative to the sample, these scores fluctuate on the positive side and sometimes in the negative side, but in the same way. So what is the difference between these groups? Now, if we look at other things, like well-being, which is one of the areas that we work with. Self-esteem, it's quite high, relatively high for the master-oriented. The score for the performance-oriented is almost on a sample mean, so you can't really see the graph. Depressive symptoms, emotional exhaustion. So now you can see a slightly different trend. So in terms of some components, there's no difference. But when we look at the well-being related to school, we can start to see a pattern. So in a sense, we could say that sometimes there is cost for striving for that success, but not necessarily so. So I will try to paint a lot broader picture of these two groups now with the following different results. So I hope you bear with me. I'm into graphs, so I hope you enjoy them too. This is something very new that we have just recently tried. We have looked at the reasons for different goals. The data is very complicated, so I try to extract something that might contribute to the discussion here today. If we look at how these two groups give reasons to mastery goals whenever they subscribe to those goals, we can see that interest has a different meaning for those groups. Utility is about the same. It's useful to learn, if you didn't know that. But then expectations, what the others are expecting us to do, we can again see quite a dramatic difference. If we switch to mastery extrinsic goals, we can see that both groups think that it validates mastery. If you get an A, it shows that you have learned. But here we have a difference. For the performance-oriented students, grades also show to the others that they are competent, while for the mastery-oriented, this is not exactly the case. And also, this fits that picture. You get respect when you get good scores or grades. If we move to performance approach goals, for performance-oriented, the added value in terms of self-esteem is one reason. The positive feeling that you get when you beat the others or outperform your peers, and again, that you fulfill the expectations. And finally, performance avoidance goals. Here, in order to understand the graph, it says that they try to avoid situations where you might fail, because failing drops your self-worth, because failure implies incompetence, and because not failing is personally important for the previous reason. They correlate quite highly. So we could say that the reasons for same goals might be quite different for differently oriented students. Now we could talk what that really is all about, what it reflects and so on. I just put it there to suggest something, but I'm not going into that any deeper. And we can go on. How does learning or the world operate? What results in learning? What results in achievement? Both groups acknowledge effort. Yes, it's important. But only performance-oriented emphasize ability. I think people following Carol Dweck's work might be happy to see that. It really reflects the same sort of idea. And how would they behave when facing difficulties? Not giving up. There's a difference, significant difference, but still even the level for the performance-oriented is below the sample mean. But fearing failure, we again see that it's a factor only for the other group. So this might have something to do with focusing on individual progress, increasing competence, social comparison, and demonstrating competence. So if we look at the same issue from an entirely different perspective, because perfectionism has everything to do with the level of goals and the satisfaction with achieving those goals, we also wanted to look how these go together. So we can see that there's a slight difference with the standards, how high goals they set, but the performance-oriented seem not to be happy with what they achieve, almost irrespective of the level of their achievement. So now, you might really want to ask, is this the key here? Is this the underlying thing? Well, to some extent, probably yes. I'm not sure if that's the most sort of comprehensive framework for that. But nevertheless, we can see that the different mindsets are there that describe and differentiate those students. So what are the short-term consequences of this? We want to sort of incorporate situations with individual differences in the same picture. So we did this experiment once. That was the time when ethical concerns were not exactly the same as they are now. So we were able to, I kindly wrote it that's task-focused and performance-focused. It should be task-involved and ego-involved condition. But in the task-involved condition, we introduced a problem-solving task to the students, a novel kind of computer simulation, and we said it's just a new kind of task to teach mathematics and problem-solving, and we would want them to explore the system and perform on the task. In the other condition, we said that it's a new measure for intelligence. It predicts success in life and work later in years, and we will also put the results out in public. Of course, afterwards we told them that, just kidding. And they were actually laughing. So the first thing is, does that instruction, everything else was the same, but does that instruction make a difference in terms of the student's interest, self-efficacy, and sort of self-protective behavior, self-handicapping? Yes, it does. Both in interest and self-efficacy, just the instruction, how we framed the same task, and self-handicapping as well. Now the next question is, if we take out from the sample the mastery-oriented and the performance-oriented, do we find similar patterns in these differences? You may guess what the outcome is. In terms of self-efficacy, in the task-focused condition, no statistical difference between the groups. But in the performance-focused condition, the self-efficacy dropped for the performance-oriented group. When there was a threat to the self, they sort of protected themselves. And this was also evident in self-handicapping. No difference in the task-focused condition, but a quite huge difference in the performance-focused condition. So I think it's interesting to see that the condition didn't really affect the master-oriented students at all. it only influenced the performance-oriented students. We have tried to follow this sort of idea of the instruction further without that sort of experimental condition. This was a natural setting study with Anna Tapola. We just wanted to see how different type of instruction would influence the students' interest as a function of these orientations again. So the key variable was situational interest, and the two conditions involved the different degree of concreteness of the instruction, slightly different challenge in terms of the cognitive load on the students. So for master-oriented students in the concrete instruction, there was a slight increase in interest, almost the same pattern for the performance-oriented students, but they dropped a bit in the end. So there's a very small interaction here, very small. Then in the abstract instruction, they started a bit lower, it was a bit more complex, but when they started to learn the system, the interest increased. At least this is our one possible interpretation. But for the performance-oriented students, the task, the condition didn't catch up with them. So you can't really explain this in the same way as the sort of threat situation, but still it shows that when the complexity and the cognitive load and the elements of the attractiveness of the task are not there, it might have an additional influence on the different types of students. You might want to ask maybe, what is the role of performance in those situations? Actually, we also know that if we ask from these students what sort of instruction they would prefer, we see that they, of course, they both appreciate instruction that focuses on learning, but then again, we see the same pattern here again. Now I'm talking about preferences. So the performance-oriented students seek information that, or potentially seek information that might help them to validate their competence. But there's always the risk that I have showed already earlier. So situation and contexts clearly function differently for these different students. Now, the very important question is, what about the long-term consequences? We followed students from the lower secondary education in Finland throughout the upper secondary education. Here, we did not use a person-oriented approach because it gets really complicated with a lot of cells when you follow them 4 or 5 years. You can try to figure that out in your head. So we just looked at the growth curves of these different orientations and what influenced those growth curves and how they predicted later outcomes. I'm not sure how well you see the boxes there, but we're focusing on self-esteem, satisfaction with life, and we also looked at depressive symptoms because we have found that it is connected to performance tendencies altogether. So previous self-esteem and school achievement influenced the starting point of the growth curves that we were looking at the next year in master orientation. We also have a context effect, which again, this is an interesting issue in Finnish education context, because there was a stronger increase in master orientation in the vocational education than what it is in the general or the more academic track. That's one of the challenges that we have in Finland. Then the initial level, already at the second measurement point, predicted depressive symptoms, self-esteem, and satisfaction with life. And what is more important is that the increase in master orientation over time significantly predicted higher self-esteem or increase in self-esteem because we controlled for the previous level. So it seems to have a sort of a positive cyclical effect on the students' well-being. Instead, if we look at performance orientation, the picture is a bit different. Depressive symptoms and self-esteem negatively predicted the initial level. Depressive symptoms earlier predicted increase in performance orientation. The initial level predicted negative self-esteem over time after controlling for previous self-esteem. And most dramatically, the increase in performance orientation significantly predicted increase in depressive symptoms, decrease in self-esteem, and decrease in satisfaction with life. So you might want to ask if there's a negative sort of cyclical, developmental cycle related to this sort of change in the motivational orientation. So I'm not saying, I'm asking, perhaps differently oriented students follow different developmental paths and cycles over time. Of course, we're interested, what are the antecedents of these different orientations? You know, where do they come from? Why are the students different? And we have seen that those differences are quite stable over time. So we're not sure how easy it is to influence them, although they are sensitive to the contextual factors. So we have been looking at temperament, a sort of a biologically based individual difference. I'm looking at two different components here. Sensitivity to punishment, doesn't really, not in the exact wording, more like the experience of threat in the environment, quite often operationalized as the sort of anticipation of failure and trying to avoid that, inhibition behavior, and then a certain kind of approach behavior related to social reward, seeking appreciation, seeking feedback that supports your sense of self, and so on. And again, we see the same sort of pattern with the sensitivity to punishment. And the same with social reward seeking, but less so. So again, there might be something in the area that we can already detect in very, very young children. Of course, these are not young children. This is a different way of approaching it, but we know that the construct is something that differentiates children already. So we wanted to look, okay, what's behind this sensitivity to punishment? How far could we go? So we took another step. We wanted to look how people's brain work in a situation where they make errors. So first we divided our sample into two groups, the ones in high in that sensitivity to punishment. It's called behavioral inhibition here, which is close to performance orientation when you look at the profiles here. And the other group that is, it's not master oriented, but it's just non-performance oriented. So the quite significant patterns of the differences show what the different groups are made of. And then we put these two groups into an experimental condition where we forced them to make errors in a very simple button pressing task. But it's done in a way that they necessarily make mistakes. And we wanted to look at the brain response into those situations, into those moments when they make the error, for example, not pressing when they're supposed to press, or pressing when they're supposed to inhibit the response. And then we get two event-related potentials in the brain. The first one is error-related negativity. Takes place about 50 seconds after the error, before you know it. And then the other one is error positivity, which is the reflection on the error. It's like, oh shit, what should I do about it? That sort of sequence, although you're not fast enough to say, oh shit. So we want to see if these two groups are different in terms of these ERPs, because they can't really control those ERPs. And what we see is a difference. The amplitude of the response is higher for the performance, what I call here the performance-oriented students. So they process more effectively that sort of situation, and they reflect upon it. It makes more effectual meaning, in a sense. So it seems that there are fundamental differences already in how these different individuals process errors. Of Of course, we know quite little about those actual responses, those brain responses, what is underlying them, but nevertheless that we can see systematic differences. We also wanted to see how those two groups, now with young children, what sort of emotions they experience, because the previous result would implicate that there's more stronger effects going on with the ones more sensitive to failure and performance. So we followed the kids through a problem-solving task, and they reported repeatedly how they felt. And we looked at these two different groups. And what we see is, it was a very interesting task. I mean, it sort of increased or enhanced positive emotions altogether and decreased negative ones. But I think what matters here is the relative difference between these groups, two groups. So there was a decrease for the low sensitive to punishment group. And the same sort of decrease, even more steeper, but what matters here is that they started from a higher level. So the initial experience was, in terms of worry, was higher for the students being performance-oriented in the terminology that I've been using here. Exactly the same with hopelessness, and then exact opposite with happiness. So they end up in a similar level, but they start from a different place. Now, if in very simple sort of implication is that think if that happens repeatedly for the kids, that they start with higher negative and lower positive emotions throughout the day in different cycles, perhaps it's quite exhausting. I don't know. We will have to see. But interesting trends that fit the pattern again. So the picture is getting larger. So perhaps we should look into those fundamental individual differences. They might be of particular relevance. So as I said in the beginning, I'm focusing on two phases of success. So we're still excluding all the other ones, some that have nothing to do with success, just trying to cope with the whole educational system. But if we narrow it down to here, I think something that John Nichols already said a long time ago really applies here. So it would seem that the goals of building and increasing competence are associated with well-being and beliefs that support learning, whereas the goals of validating and demonstrating competence are associated with ill-being and beliefs that impede learning. Now, if I try somehow wickedly go back to where we started with the context, the Finnish educational discourse, this is the sort of information that I would want them to take into account when they think about the reform. So in these words, this might sound very simple, but I think it's very challenging. How could we promote well-doing, achieving, striving, and success without sacrificing well-being? What would be the sort of strategies that we could apply and introduce to the whole educational system that would help us to help those kids who have these sort of tendencies that seem to be quite okay in terms of success, but also seem to come with a cost? I've introduced a lot of different constructs here, so we might want to ask, which are the ones we would want to focus on? What is the key? As I said earlier, Harold Dweck would probably say that it's the implicit theories. Somebody else, I think Avi might talk about student identity. I added it there just because of you. Temperament, goals, depending on the framework and your approach as a scientist, you might want to sort of contribute to the discussion in different ways. I have no answer to this. I have some ideas, but no answer to this. But perhaps if we have time, we can discuss the big picture and the implications of that, because we're talking about motivated persons and challenging contexts. So my thank you to all the people who have worked with me on this project. Thank you.
Thank you for a lot of innovative ideas on research on goal orientations and related constructs, and for challenging also questions without a definite answer. Just before giving the word to the audience, I myself would like to underline one very interesting approach, in my opinion, which concerns that first part where you were relating goals and reasons, because I think that one very good approach to understanding the relations between goals and reasons is doing it in an integrated way, as is what is underlying your approach, because you say, for example, that not every goal is related to every reason. And I think this is an interesting approach to disentangling and understanding well these relations and the meaning of goals, because it is also my conviction that if you separate the reason from the goal loses a lot of its meaning. But, well, I think this is, for me, very interesting to see this approach. And I'd like, of course, to give the word to any question, any comment that anyone wishes to make. And thank you.
Well saved 20 minutes. I wanted to keep it short because of the next session, but...
Yes, that's the question.
That's an intriguing profile of variables, differentiating between these two broad orientations. With regard to the different distinct goals, you differentiate between intrinsic and extrinsic mastery goals, but not between approach and avoidance mastery goals. You distinguish between approach and avoidance performance goals, but not between intrinsic and extrinsic performance goals. So you use one distinction for mastery goals and the other one for performance goals. What's the rationale for that? You didn't talk about that in the beginning. You wanted to go on. But what's the rationale for having these two distinct dichotomizations for the two types of goals?
Well, I think mastery and performance goals are fundamentally quite different. So I don't think you have to apply the same sort of logic to all different goals. I mean, how would you apply that to avoidance goals? I know that one solution is to leave the avoidance goals out, because they have nothing to do with competence. But when we look at the educational context, we see a lot of students following that sort of goal. So we're looking at the sort of goals, or as I said, goals and outcomes that reflect or manifest themselves in the kind of orientation towards whatever happens in the school. I would say it's more educational than psychological. And we see that students try for mastery, but they might have different criteria for that. Some students explain in interviews that when we ask, when do you know that you have learned? Because I have that sort of experience of understanding. Some other students say, well, when I get the grade, I will know. So they strive for the same thing for different reasons. But I think performance has more to do with the sense of self, with self-enhancement versus self-protection. And I don't think you can really apply the same motivational or the motive background for mastery. So I think our approach is more pragmatic than theoretically logical in that sense. And the combination of these goals seem to describe quite well the different types of students. They seem to make sense. So let's say it's a pragmatic approach. By the way, the mastery intrinsic, mastery extrinsic, they're just terms that we started to use in order to sort of make this previously mentioned differentiation. Originally, and still in Finnish, you cannot even use the same terms. In Finnish, we use mastery and achievement goal because it describes the goal better. We did that in the first paper, and the reviewer said, there's another construct with the same name. Try something else. So we ended up with this. And I regret it.
So I was changing focus a little bit here. Sorry if you wanted to keep that going. But I was wondering what the reaction is of educational policy makers in Finland to the drop in the PISA test scores. Is it ratcheting up the pressure and wanting kids to do more work rather than being concerned about the well-being parts? So the doing is getting to be more important, or are they receptive to notions of maybe changing goals might make a difference in terms of that? How is that going over?
Well, I think the policymakers are quite sensitive to the drop in PISA results. But it's validated with some other national research as well. We can see that the level of mathematical competence, for example, is dropping. And they sort of see that this PISA results and these changes are reflecting the same issue, the problem with our system. At the same time, I think they still try to hold on to that myth that kids don't like school in Finland, used as an argument to counterattack the decrease in these PISA and these other results. But I think the lively discussion have actually brought these different issues also to play, where if you look at the reform, the outcomes of the reform in terms of the new national curriculum, I think it's quite encouraging for us because it really gives you a lot of room to develop the school and education and teaching in the way that fits our view of how the students operate. Well, I had a slide on that. It was an interesting misunderstanding a while ago in the international press. They said that Finland is giving up subjects. No more math and history was one of the headlines. Now we're just introducing the sort of phenomenon-based education as one part of the system, but we still have subjects. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
You closed with a reference to John Nicholas, and John Nicholas said, really, we should promote mastery goals in schools. That should be the goal. On the basis of all of your research that you presented, did you reach a different conclusion, or is that the same conclusion you reached?
I think it is the same.
Can I ask a follow-up then?
Maybe. Depends on what you're going to say.
Like one of the major developments in research on achievement goals has been a greater articulation of the number of goals and separating goals from reasons and that kind of thing. But if it still leads to the same conclusion, what's the advance?
The advancement of the science. We need to understand those things better, even though the sort of very simple implication would be the same. Also, as I said, if they are as stable and as difficult to influence or have an influence on, I think we should need to know better where they come from, how they develop, what moderates them, in order to improve also the educational response to that. Instructional practices, we're not sure what really works in a natural environment. No. Yes? No? Yes.
I'm just thinking, I mentioned the Swedish yesterday who are not at all concerned about performance and who are performing very well. I was just thinking, on Monday I'm going to a meeting that we are trying to reform our Finnish high school system, because the problem is that boys are not doing well, and there may be some cultural differences. It may be there is some indications that this kind of BIS reaction, inhibitory reaction, and this kind of slowly warming up temperament, maybe a bit defensive, pessimistic, may be overrepresented in some cultures and also culturally supported, like Finnish and Asian cultures are a bit similar in that sense. It may be that in some other cultures people are more tolerant for focusing on performance and external validation. And I think this cross-cultural in the future, kind of looking at cross-culturally, these things might be, might have to do with identities and so on. So maybe we slightly disagree of these things because there are some cultural differences. For instance, United States, Finland, may be rather different as contexts. But this is our problem, but then also your data is quite international. You'll be collaborating also with colleagues from other countries. But I think it's important to talk about this, and I really value about all these different levels that you bring to this discussion. Thank you. I can say something on Monday on the meeting again.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote to this. Once we wanted to do a collaboration with the Swedish university, or actually the policymakers, the government, we wanted to measure these things with the Swedish students, and these guys said, no. You cannot ask if you want to outperform your peer in Sweden, but we did it anyway. The Swedish students were higher on performance approach than the Finnish ones. Yeah. So that's different sort of perspectives into the same issues. But yeah, I agree. Huge cultural differences as well.
First of all, super data and super talk, so thanks very much. I wanted to, two questions. Your sense, can your approach help us understand or predict who doesn't like school? First one. And the second one, what's your sense really that kids come into grade 1 with these kind of hardwired tendencies and that's it?
That's all?
Seriously?
The ones who
no,
do not like...
And then the implication is what? Just try and... For those who come in too sensitive? Or...
Let me start with the first one.
Yeah.
What predicts those who do not like school? I don't know where it starts from, but those are mostly the ones that we classify as, or they themselves actually classify, which is analyze it, but they report it, who classify themselves as avoidance oriented. Yes.
Work avoidance
oriented.
Okay.
What that usually means is they are not necessarily doing that badly in terms of well-being. They're just bored, not interested, and they don't see the value of education in the same way that the others do. But the challenge is that we don't have the sort of data that we could actually look at the different subgroups in the ones who do not like school, because in Finnish the term liking school is very broad, and the reason for that might be quite different things. But we see a correlation between those two. But then again, we're not sure why do they end up being that avoidant or work avoidant. What was the second question? The first graders already?
The kids start off,
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We haven't worked with young children that much, so I wouldn't consider myself as an expert in children in that early education. So I'm not sure what sort of environment they are introduced to from a motivational perspective. Why do the teachers already after the first semester, why are they able to sort of find these different differences in these students in terms of these constructs that we look at? I mean, they don't actually do exams, they have no grades, they don't have the normal sort of performance structure part of the school play that influences a lot of how the students orient themselves towards different activities in the school. I mean, it's commonly said that we don't have tests in Finland. That's not true. We have a lot of exams, but not standardized tests. Even the general upper secondary education is entirely guided and directed by the matriculation examination. The whole 3 years is entirely directed by that goal. So there's a lot of performance going on. But I'm not sure how that works in the early education. Somehow it does. And that fits with those temperamental differences that seem to feed on that sort of approach.
Okay, please, Eleftheria. You have time for one more question.
Yeah. Okay, continuing Ruth's question. Yeah. How large is this work avoidant group in your
It changed.
You said that the students who don't like school have the profile of being work avoidant. So how large is this group? So should we suppose that the other groups still like school? And I'm asking this question because at least based on the previous PISA evaluations that Finnish students are the top students and they perform very well and things like that, we also get the impression that they feel also safe and well in Finnish classrooms, and you apply also friendly to the students' instructional approaches. So it was a bit awkward to hear that Finnish students don't like school. So what about the other?
They do like.
They do like.
I'm trying to get rid of that myth.
Okay.
But the thing is, in Finland, I mean, the educational system works, the schools work, teachers, the relationship between students and teachers are good, family support, education is valued. If you then say that you don't like school, in that context, it might mean that we don't have sofas, or our chairs are broken, or the air is bad. So it's a bit different context to many other countries. Also, the expression is quite different because I think it was 92% of the 9th graders in Finland consider school as useful. 92. So if you contrast that with, well, it's a bit boring every once in a while, I'm not so excited about that. But then there's also, because they have demands, as I showed you in the beginning, the experience of burden, of workload is relatively high. It's higher for girls. It's higher for general upper secondary education, where the demands go up. That's quite high, and that might contribute, if you can't respond to that, that might contribute to avoidance. But as I said, there's different groups within that population. Some would just excel in skateboarding, so they don't have time for school. So, you know, complex issue.
Okay, I think it's time to close this session, thanking the audience and of course Markku. Thank you very much.